Chinese hegemony might be happening. This was the headline of a recent article in Foreign Policy by Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard University, warning that China's rise, at least in Asia, seemed inevitable. In the piece, Walt argues that through a series of decisions, including pulling out of international organizations, imposing tariffs on nearly every country in the world, and starting the war in Iran, which has spiked global fuel prices, President Donald Trump has basically gifted the region to China on a silver platter. Quoting the professor here, Trump has done just about everything someone would do if they consciously wanted China to supplant the United States and establish a dominant position in its immediate region. And Walt isn't the only one warning that China is on the ascendancy. Kishore Manbabani, a Singaporean diplomat who served as the former president of the United Nations Security Council, has been making a similar argument for years, including in his book, Has China Won? But what makes this moment so notable is that much of America's foreign policy toward Asia has been shaped by a need to stop, or at the very least delay, China's rise. For that to have been abandoned would be perhaps the Trump team's biggest pivot yet. Yet even if Walt is right, and the Trump administration is no longer working to contain Beijing, that doesn't mean nobody is on the case. In fact, the region's best hope may currently lie with an island nation 25 times smaller than China, the former military powerhouse known as Japan. The Rising Sun. For most of its post-World War II history, Japan's role in regional security was pretty simple. It would host American troops, it would pay a share of the costs, and leave the heavy lifting to Washington. That arrangement worked well enough during the Cold War, but it depended entirely on the US being a willing partner committed to the region. And Japan's political class wasn't convinced that this status quo would remain indefinitely. In 2015, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government pushed through legislation that allowed Japan's self-defense forces to fight in limited cases of collective self-defense. These were instances where an attack on an allied nation posed a threat to Japan's survival. Previously, the law permitted the use of force only if Japan itself came under attack. At the time, this change was extremely controversial. However, the law passed, and it opened the floodgates for more reforms. In 2017, Abe scrapped Japan's 1% spending defense cap, which, while not enshrined in law, was often seen as one of the greatest obstacles restricting meaningful defense reforms. The following year, Tokyo created the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, meant to defend and retake remote islands, a not-so-subtle reference to the islands in the East China Sea that Tokyo and Beijing both claim as their own. That same year, Tokyo announced plans to modify its Azuma-class destroyers so that they could operate F-35B fighter jets, of which Japan planned to buy 147 units. Although it's stretching the term a little, this led some to declare that Tokyo now had its first aircraft carrier since the end of World War II. But while Abe may have started Japan's remilitarization, it is his newly elected protege who looks likely to finish the job. According to Daisuke Kawai, a professor at the University of Tokyo, no one has been more committed to this shift than the Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi, who took office in October last year. This April, she unveiled the largest overhaul of Tokyo's defense export rules in decades. As part of these changes, her government removed restrictions on the sale of arms overseas, paving the way for the sale of missiles, warships, and other weapon systems. Most of the region has been thrilled by these changes, especially the Philippines, with Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro telling the press that the change would give Manila access to high-quality weapons to strengthen domestic defense and contribute to regional security through deterrence. A quote many interpreted as a not-so-veiled shot at China. Apart from opening up the country's defense industry, Takaichi also increased defense spending to 2% of Japan's GDP and has pledged to spend more. To say this has raised concerns in Beijing is a little like saying that Season 3 of One Punch Man was only mildly disappointing. But nothing raised China's hackles quite like a statement Takaichi made in Parliament last November, one which saw the Japanese PM declare that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan, implying that Tokyo might invoke the 2015 law signed by Abe to come to Taiwan's aid. China was, to put it mildly, livid. Beijing accused Takaichi of attempting to revive Japan's colonial past, a highly charged claim given the war crimes Imperial Japan committed in China. It also discouraged Chinese tourists from traveling to Japan, suspended seafood imports, and banned the export of dual-use items to 20 Japanese companies that it claimed were supplying the Japanese military. China's response wasn't just limited to diplomatic and trade retaliation. In December last year, Chinese fighter jets locked their radar onto Japanese aircraft, forcing Japan to scramble its own jets in response. All of this marks an attempt by Beijing to force Takaichi to apologize. So far, though, Takaichi has resisted that pressure, with polling suggesting the issue has not cost her any support. Polls conducted in December showed 70% of the country backing her, a figure that most Western governments would kill to have. But antagonizing Beijing and revitalizing the defense industry is one thing. Far more consequential in the long run might be Takaichi's attempts to build a regional coalition that can stand up to China. Now, before we get into members of that coalition, just a quick breather to tell you about our own unbeatable alliance. Frontstock.co is our subscriber site for people who want to dig deeper into the major conflict and geopolitical stories shaping our world. Every week we publish 2 exclusive videos, plus 2 expert-written articles, plus podcasts covering everything from the war in Ukraine to the rolling crises in the Middle East to the pre-game alliances shaping East Asia. It costs just $5 a month or $50 a year. It's worth checking out if you want even more of me on camera telling you about things that are absolutely terrifying. And as if 6 days a week on war fronts wasn't enough. That's Frontstock.co. It's $5 a month. Please do check it out. And now let's get back to these new allies, starting with the most unlikely one of all, South Korea. Allies and partners. Now, given the long memories of Japanese wartime atrocities in the region, the identity of some nations in Takaichi's coalition might come as a surprise, especially the biggest partner of all, South Korea. Tokyo and Seoul have a complicated relationship, and that feels like a bit of an understatement. Japan colonized Korea from 1910 to 1945, and during that period committed atrocities so horrific that we can't mention them here on YouTube without risking getting demonetized. That's the sort of stuff we cover on Fronts.co. Those wounds have never fully healed. In 2018, tensions between the two nations came to a head after South Korea's Supreme Court ordered a Japanese company to compensate South Koreans for their forced labor during World War II. This triggered a chain of reactions that saw both countries downgrade each other's trade status, with Seoul even threatening to scrap an intelligence sharing agreement with Tokyo, although that didn't end up happening because of American pressure. Although this happened under a mentor, Shinzo Abe, Takaichi has been working tirelessly to change that. Since taking office, she and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung have met 4 times in roughly 6 months, a pace that would have been unthinkable just a few short years ago. During their January meeting, which was held in Nara, Takaichi's hometown, the two leaders agreed to deepen security ties to counter growing concerns in East Asia, another not-so-subtle nod to China. This was reaffirmed in their most recent meeting, held about a week ago. While South Korea is an important part of the puzzle for Takaichi, it isn't the only piece that she's been methodically slotting into place. As we mentioned previously, Japan's decision to open up its defense industry for global exports has drawn a lot of attention from Manila, but this is just one small way that the two countries have been cooperating. In January, Tokyo and Manila signed an agreement allowing for the tax-free provision of ammunition, food, fuel, and other necessities when the nation's troops train together. This agreement was put in place to support the implementation of the 2025 Reciprocal Access Agreement, or RAA, which allows the two countries to deploy their forces to each other's territory for joint exercises, disaster response, and other missions to enhance interoperability. Further south, Tokyo has also sought closer ties with Australia, signing a deal worth $6.5 billion for the delivery of a fleet of Japanese-designed warships. Takaichi also announced the launch of Power Asia, a somewhat tortuous acronym for Partnership on Wide Energy and Resources Resilience Asia. They should really ask the Americans how to do this. A $10 billion financing program aimed at boosting energy security on the continent. Now, each of these moves is significant on its own. Taken together, they suggest that Japan is actively looking to challenge Chinese dominance in the region. And that raises a couple of interesting questions. 1, how will China respond to this? And 2, will Japan's efforts be enough to stop China? Now, so far we've already discussed China's attempts forcing Takaichi to apologize, but Beijing's response to Japan's military resurgence goes well beyond trade restrictions and radar lock-ons over Okinawa. During President Trump's meeting with President Xi in mid-May, the latter criticized Prime Minister Takaichi's defense push, according to the Financial Times. The Times reported that Xi was agitated when discussing Japan's increased military spending, and that this was the most heated part of the meeting. Additionally, Trump administration officials were caught off guard by how annoyed Xi was, as Japan had not been a topic in the bilateral talks leading up to the meeting. Xi Jinping works very hard to project the image of a leader who is cool, calm, and always in control. So for him to allow that mask to slip, even in a private meeting with Trump and other officials, is a glaring admission that China is worried about Japan's actions. But China has done more than just complain at bilateral meetings. According to figures published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, China increased its defense spending by 7.4% in 2025, bringing its estimated total to $336 billion. However, we should also point out that SIPRI and other analysts have long noted that China does not fully disclose its military expenditure, meaning that the real figures could be orders of magnitude higher. For 2026, Beijing announced that it would boost defense spending by another 7%. While this was the lowest increase in 5 years, according to Reuters, it still outstripped military spending across the rest of the continent. During the opening of the Chinese parliament, Premier Li Qiang said that Beijing was focused on improving its combat readiness and developing advanced combat capabilities. Beyond the budget figures, China has been sending more pointed signals about its military capabilities. On Christmas Day 2025, roughly 2,000 Chinese fishing vessels abruptly stopped their normal activities and assembled into 2 long parallel formations in the East China Sea, each stretching more than 400 kilometers long. According to the New York Times, the ships did this again on the 11th of January, assembling into a rectangle formation that was so dense that some approaching cargo ships had to skirt around them or zigzag in order to pass through. They also did the same in March, with Jason Wang, Chief Operating Officer of Ingenia Space, a company that analyzes satellite imagery and ship signals data, telling the AFP that around 1,200 boats massed in 2 parallel lines further east of the January and December events had held their positions for about 30 hours. These ships are part of China's maritime militia, a ragtag group of fishermen who have received some military training and can be called up to fight alongside the Navy. While it wasn't immediately clear why these ships were assembling en masse, Gregory Pauling, director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, wrote in the New York Times that he believed it was to test how civilian vessels would respond if ordered to assemble in a future crisis, such as the blockade of Taiwan. The fact that China could get thousands of vessels to coordinate in the seas, even if they were all civilian vessels, while Japan only only has 154 vessels in its entire navy, underscores just how massive the current gap is between the two nations. And this is before we even consider China's 234 warships. Beijing often uses this impressive fleet to engage in grey zone tactics. According to the East Asia Forum, in 2025, the Chinese Coast Guard spent 335 consecutive days in the waters around the Japanese-administered Senkaku Islands. In 2024, they had spent 215 consecutive days within those waters. And such tactics are not just limited to Japan. In 2025, China violated Taiwanese airspace more than 3,700 times, and according to Reuters, launched more than 2.8 million cyber attacks per day, up from 2.4 million in 2024. In the South China Sea, Chinese vessels harassed ships from the Philippines, and Chinese aircraft continue to aggressively challenge air patrols from Australia with unsafe maneuvers. Away from the military, Beijing is also competing with Japan on the economic front, using its Belt and Road Initiative and the debt attached to those projects to build an influence network greater than what Tokyo currently has access to. Whether these countries would rush to Beijing's aid in a confrontation with Japan is an open question, especially given how poorly Chinese debt is viewed in most places saddled with it. However, that doesn't mean Beijing isn't capable of exerting influence over these nations. All of which leads us to our final question. Has Japan done enough to counter China? And right off the bat, we're going to say that no, we don't think Japan has done enough to counter China. I mean, don't get us wrong, what Japan has built over the past decade is genuinely impressive, but it falls well short of matching China, let alone positioning Tokyo as Beijing's equal in the region capable of stopping its ascent. The main reason for this is time. China has spent decades shoring up its military, building out its economy, coordinating the Belt and Road Initiative, and doing everything in its power to boost its profile across the entire world. Japan, on the other hand, only started in earnest in 2015, and even then progress was gradual until Takaichi arrived. Beijing's head start is so massive that it would take Japan decades to catch up. As we mentioned earlier, China has 234 warships and its shipyards are building many more each year. According to a study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or SIS, between 2019 and 2023, China's 4 largest shipyards produced 39 warships. While Japan is investing in its navy, it simply does not have the capacity to match that rate of production. And speaking of investment, while Japan has spent about 2% of its GDP on defense, in raw numbers that comes out to $62.2 billion. China spent nearly 5 times more at $336 billion, and again, they might be underreporting what they actually spent on the military. We also have to talk about China's economic might. China is the main trading partner for many countries in the region, and Japan's economy is nowhere near large enough to either absorb that amount of trade or replace what China produces. And finally, there's the question of population. Japan's demographic crisis is, by the government's own admission, an existential problem. In 2024, Japan recorded nearly 1 million more deaths than births, which was the steepest population decline since the government began conducting surveys in 1968. And while China does have its own demographic crisis, it's not as acute as that facing Japan. Now, just looking at military spending and population alone cannot tell you who would win a war. If it could, Russia would now be holding victory parades in Kyiv instead of begging Zelensky not to attack its parades in Moscow, and America would be dictating terms to Iran rather than giving ground in negotiations. However, they are still useful metrics, and by these metrics, Tokyo is clearly the underdog. With all that said though, the framing of whether Japan can match China may be asking the wrong question entirely. Instead of trying to rival China, Japan could be trying to position itself as a credible alternative for countries in the region that are uncomfortable with the idea of Chinese dominance, but have no one else to turn to. For many years, many Asian governments have had to walk a careful line between accepting Chinese trade and infrastructure investment, while at the same time trying to resist Chinese influence and protect themselves from Chinese aggression. Take the Philippines. Despite the issues between Manila and Beijing in the South China Sea, China is Manila's largest trading partner. The Philippines is also a major buckle in the Belt and Road Initiative, with multiple projects, including the Sangley Point International Airport and the Binondo Intramuros Bridge, having been constructed with funding and expertise from China. If Japan is able to offer countries like the Philippines a choice between Tokyo and Beijing, rather than a choice between Beijing or rotting infrastructure, that could go a long way towards curbing China's influence. And the good news is that Tokyo is already trying to do this through initiatives such as Power Asia. But perhaps the best thing Tokyo could do would be to assemble the other countries in the region into a NATO-style alliance capable of standing up to Chinese aggression. The framework is already there. Japan has deepened its military ties with nearly every nation in the region, and with its defense industry open for business, those ties are bound to strengthen. And most of these countries are already bound together, to a greater or lesser degree, by their bilateral defense agreements with America. The question then becomes whether there is the political will to inform such an organization. Any country that hints at joining or forming such an alliance will have to deal with unprecedented levels of Chinese harassment. In the worst-case scenario, China might even refuse to trade with them. Still, that might be a price worth paying to create an alliance that can effectively stand up to China. Because at least in Asia, one country, no matter how powerful, can't do it alone. Thank you for watching.